Hello, you're watching the Daily Roundup by People's Dispatch, where we bring you some of the top stories from around the world. Let's take a look at the headlines. UN raises alarm over humanitarian crisis in Syria. Peru groups stage vigil for protesters killed in government violence. Turkey raises minimum wage by 55%. Rail workers in Portugal strike demanding higher wages. Syria's permanent representative to the UN, Bassam Sagbag, told the UN Security Council on Wednesday, December 21, that solving the crisis in Syria requires that it takes measures against the continued presence of the foreign troops on the Syrian lands, Israel's recurrent airstrikes inside its territory, and unilateral sanctions imposed by the US and its allies. He added that solving the crisis in Syria requires a move by the UN Security Council to stop Israeli recurrent attacks, remove the illegitimate blockade, and support the early recovery projects. There are hundreds of US personnel stationed in northeastern Syria and at the illegal military base in Al-Tamf. The Syrian government has also accused US forces of looting over 100 billion US dollars worth of Syrian oil, gas, and other natural resources. Reports additionally noted the fact that Israel has carried out hundreds of airstrikes inside Syria since the beginning of the war, causing massive damage to the country's infrastructure and killed dozens of people. Turkey too has invaded Syria several times over the last few years and now controls a large part of its territory. The country has also been accused of providing military and political support to anti-government fighters. Recently, Turkey launched air and artillery strikes, causing deaths and destruction of essential services delivery infrastructure such as water supply. Sabag expressed surprise at widespread ignorance about US occupation forces and US-backed militias looting Syrian oil resources and agricultural products such as wheat. During his briefing to the UN Security Council, Geir Pedersen, UN Special Envoy to Syria, claimed that the humanitarian situation in the country has deteriorated and that conditions in non-government controlled areas are much worse than those in the government controlled areas. Pedersen claimed that over 14.6 million Syrians require some kind of support to face their daily needs and that this number is 1.2 million higher than last year. He also said that this number is further expected to rise next year. Pedersen noted that more than 90% of Syrians are forced to live below the poverty line and at least 80% of them are food insecure. He also noted that basic services and resources such as electricity, fuel, water and healthcare are also scarce. The unavailability of fuel has forced the Syrian government to declare holidays for days and weeks as means to save energy. A number of civil society organizations, rights groups, and trade unions on Thursday, December 22, staged protests against the brutal and violent ongoing crackdown by security forces against protesters in Peru. Thousands of protesters have been taking part in demonstrations in support of former President Pedro Castillo since December 7. The demonstrations began after Castillo was ousted by right-wing dominated Peruvian Congress. He was subsequently charged with a number of serious charges such as conspiracy, breaching the constitutional order, disturbing public peace and abuse of authority. He was placed under detention for 7 days at first, which was later extended by a court for the next 18 months. Protesters have been steadfast in their demands of the dissolution of Congress, release and reinstatement of Castillo as president, new elections, and the resignation of current President Dina Boluarte, who was Castillo's vice president before his ouster. Yesterday's protests saw the participation of thousands of workers of the General Confederation of Workers of Peru, that's CGTP, Nuevo Peru, CUT Peru, among other trade unions and groups. The protesters gathered in front of the Palace of Justice in the Peruvian capital Lima and held a vigil to pay homage to the protesters killed in the security forces' violence, along with demanding justice and accountability for the victims. According to latest reports, 27 protesters have been killed in the anti-coup government so far. The demonstrators further denounced the arbitrary arrests and detentions of the hundreds of protesters and demanded their release along with Castillo's. They further resolved to continue their protests in the face of the intensifying state violence and repression until their demands are met, adding that the country's democratic system is under threat of turning into a dictatorship. In a related development, a delegation from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, that's IACHR, met with President Castillo in prison to verify the conditions he is being detained in. Following the visit by the Ombudsman of Peru, who was accompanied by a technical team, the Ombudsman on Twitter said that they found Castillo's prison conditions to be in accordance with Penal Enforcement Code requirements. Moving on to the third story, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on Thursday, December 22, announced a hike of nearly 55% in the minimum wages in the country from next year. The announcement was made after the Turkish government signed an agreement with the country's trade unions who have been demanding a sharper hike. According to Erdogan's announcement, the new monthly minimum wage in Turkey will be 8,500 Turkish lira or 455 US dollars. It is currently 5,500 Turkish lira. The increase in wage has been demanded by the country's trade unions and left parties for a long time now as a way to deal with an unprecedented inflation in Turkey. The sustained high inflation, which is now over 80%, has erased real wages and created an unprecedented cost of living crisis. Despite a double-digit growth rate, according to a survey conducted earlier this year, over 70% of all Turkish people now find it difficult to get enough food for their families. The inflation and fall in the value of the Turkish lira has erased their purchasing power. Trade unions have been demanding the increase in the minimum wages. Thursday's announcement of the increase in the minimum wage is the third such increase this year. It was last raised to 4,250 Turkish lira in the beginning of 2022 and in June to 5,500 Turkish lira. With the latest raise now, the minimum wage will be almost double to what it was in the beginning of 2022. The government claims that the increase may help around 37% of the country's workforce which survives on the minimum wages. Trade unions have expressed apprehension that even after the recent hike, the majority of Turkish people will still not be able to meet their basic needs due to high prices of all basic commodities. Turkey's official year-to-year inflation rate had hit above 85% in October, which was the highest in 24 years. In November, it marginally fell to 84.39%. However, unofficial sources estimate it to be above 170%. And finally, rail workers in Portugal on December 23, Friday, launched a strike demanding a wage hike amid steadily rising inflation and a crippling cost of living crisis. Workers belonging to various unions coming together under two common platforms, CP and IP, are taking part in the strike. Besides Friday, the workers will strike again on December 26 over their demands. They're demanding a financial bonus from the employers to compensate for the loss of purchasing power they have faced this year as a result of the declining economic situation. They have additionally asked for the government to raise the food subsidy provided to workers along with ending discrimination between workers from different sectors in terms of the rate of subsidy. Following their decision to launch the strike, the CP platform on its website warned daily train users and other travelers of the disturbances of the movements of train nationwide, adding that the disruptions could extend to even the days before and after the strike dates. It additionally expressed regret for the inconvenience caused to customers due to the strike, adding that customers who have already purchased train tickets on the strike days can apply for a full refund within the next 10 days. The unions whose workers are staging the industrial action included FENTCOP, National Union of Transport, Communications and Public Works, SINDFR, National Democratic Union of Railways, STF, Union of Railway Transport, SINFB, National Independent Union of Railway Workers, among several others. Rail workers had already staged a strike on November 30 for their demands, leading to the cancellation of hundreds of trains, but their demands remain unaddressed. And that's all for today's episode. For more such stories, visit our website peoplesdispatch.org and also follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram.